Right, good afternoon, everybody. Let's resume. Mr. Humphreys, how are you doing on time on cross-examination?
I'm doing really well, sir, thank you.
Good to hear. Okay, over to you then. Oh, I suppose before we go over to you, there was the matter, wasn't there, of the document handed in. Sorry, I've got the scribbled over version. I didn't know if you wanted to come back on it, Mr. Foley, and obviously if you do, there may be some questions.
Yes, I'd like to, if that's possible.
By all means. Over to you then.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, thank you obviously for providing this data that we've got in front of us, which is, the key thing here is looking at seats provided by BMI Regional out of Bristol during the time series that's shown. Now, obviously, this is being used as a key element to point out the impact on business traffic and how we looked at the interpretation of the results looking forward to 2019. So what I've done is, by taking the numbers, I've had a bit of a deeper dive in the time I've had over lunch to see what this means in reality and to do some number crunching and to bring up some other data from public sources like the CAA to see what that means in reality. To understand the real scale, because remember, this is looking at it in terms of seats, not passengers. And remember, you know, what we want to try and do is compare like with like where we can. So, so one of the things I've done is looked at, from the CAA data on airlines, what BMI's average, BMI regional, sorry to clarify, not BMI mainline, BMI regional's average load factor for the airline was in those years. And what we saw is that taking the 2015, and what I've done is I've looked just briefly at 2018 for a moment to get an idea of where they were. They were operating at 54.6% average load factor for the year in 2015 and 62% in 2018. So what that means is that of every seat they had and of every service they flew, 54% of the seats would be filled, typically on their network, and obviously the remainder would be left empty. So that's something to bear in mind when you look at the numbers of the seats and you kind of factor down. So what that would mean, for example, on 2015 numbers is that 145,258 would, by my calculations, be 79,310, of which, and then on the 2018 figures, that means that 197,000 comes down to 122,283. So that's the first thing I would say on that. So in effect, in 2015, it works out at about 1.2% of the passengers at the airport, and with 2018, it's 1.4%, if we assume that they then followed that same profile into 2019 and they're not gone bust. So then the other thing I looked at as well is the replacement with other airlines stepping in 2019, because obviously the only picture we've got here is what happened with BMI Regional. And so I've looked at some of the routes to see, you know, what is significant and what matters. And there are certain ones, obviously, where BMI Regional going has made a difference. You know, with Frankfurt, in particular the German routes, with Frankfurt and Munich being, you know, the two big ones there. And that gives no surprise why Lufthansa would want to relaunch the service, clearly because there's that market there. But on Paris, for example, where EasyJet also operate, to Paris Charles de Gaulle, in 2019, actually the overall numbers, according to the CAA, of people travelling from Bristol to Paris, Charles de Gaulle in 2019 was considerably up on 2018. And that's despite the failure of BMI Regional, because there were other alternatives there. Likewise with Aberdeen, likewise with Milan, there are other options there. So that's something to take into account there when you actually then work out the maths to look down and see what the overall impact is. The other thing which I haven't calculated yet, but also you then take further into the numbers as well, is according to, and okay, this is something that is being quoted by Routes Online, which is one of the people who look very much around data and schedules and so on. They, in late 2017, was explaining that BMI Regional's traffic is broadly split 2/3 business and 1/3 leisure. So, you know, on top of that, the other thing to bear in mind, okay, that is overall for the airline, you know, we have to recognise that, but it also then shows again with those numbers that actually, if you then look at what proportion is actually business traffic, obviously that number comes down considerably again. So I think that's what I would say from having just the chance I've had to look at the data in the time we've had, I think, that's something to be aware of, and what that means for the numbers overall. It becomes a much, much smaller amount than what they say, and therefore, in terms of that overall business growth from 2015 to 2019, it does move it up slightly, but it's not, it's not the whole reason why that number is as low as it is.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Mr. Humphreys, either on that or indeed...
Yes. Just on that, Mr. Foley, I think you've just illustrated, haven't you, why your shorter 4-year time periods are completely unreliable. Firstly, of course, your 1.2% and 1.4% are just one way, so you would need to double those for two-way, wouldn't you?
No, that was two-way.
That's two-way, because you gave us the figures in here from one way.
The 145,258, is that one way or two-way?
That's one way.
Okay.
So they should be doubled, shouldn't
they?
Sorry. That's one way. I did say that this morning. So you would need to double your percentages.
Okay. Yeah.
So you get to 2.4 and 2.8%. Yes, you're absolutely right. There were not all of those were business passengers, but it's a high percentage. But your difference between 2015 in your table and 2019 is only a difference of 3%. And what you're already showing is that the vast majority of that fall is through the demise of BMI.
Well, that's not what I've said, because obviously with other routes increasing that were formerly BMI ones, you can't say that with certainty that that's what I'm saying.
Mr. Foley, don't you see, this is exactly why these complications, why looking at these two dates only is just inherently unreliable.
But equally, that's why with a set of data in front of me, I want to get deeper into the numbers to see the real reasons behind it and the different elements that are involved. And that's what I've done in the time I've had, which has been put in front of me, to see the explanations and the reasons and the implications of what that means.
Well, I can obviously ask Mr. Brass to go into this. Let's move on. And talk about fleet mix. And you start in your section, paragraph 7.3, don't you? You make the point that there was a lack of sensitivity testing here about the fleet mix, but as we've agreed, in a sense, what the inspectors are interested in is not fleet mix. What they're really interested in is environmental impacts.
Well, the fleet mix obviously then has the implications.
Correct.
But yes.
And environmental impacts are things that can be controlled through conditions.
Potentially, yes.
Yes. You then in your paragraph 7.5 make the point about the Jet 2 announcement once again, and 7.7 you say that a Jet 2 fleet mix may be materially different. So even at its highest, you're not saying the Jet 2 fleet mix will be different from that anticipated. It just may be, looking into the future.
With anything like that, then yes, there's not 100% certainty on something like that, but there is a
but then
reality
let's
it may be different.
Pick that up and see how plausible it is that it will be materially different. You produced your table 3. Mr. Brass then in his rebuttal pointed out a number of errors in your table, and at his appendix B produced what he called a corrected Mr. Foley fleet, which didn't have quite as many new generation aircraft because it was your fleet mix, not his, but got to 70% new generation as opposed to his 73%. And then the not sure if it's the final iteration, but the next iteration of all of this was your further evidence, which was handed around on Friday, the little document that looks like this. And here you produce yet another version of the table. So our fleet mix, your fleet mix old, your fleet mix then updated, and then a difference column. Yeah? So let's just go through some of the changes. So the first point that Mr. Brass made was that the Boeing 767-400ER, which you had in your old, your original fleet mix, he pointed out was only flown by United and Delta, no evidence that those airlines were planning to fly routes from Bristol, a very old aircraft anyway. And you tell us that you have accepted that correction.
So where we are with something like that is what we've done with some of those. The element of what we tried to do was to try and...
No, didn't ask you about what you were trying to do. Asked you whether you'd accepted that correction.
Yes, and the reason we accepted that correction is because what we were trying to do with the fleet mix is to reach a comparable one with what Mr. Brass had produced, but obviously with the dynamics of Jet 2 in there. Now, the 767-400 is used out of other UK airports. United Airlines used to fly it out of Bristol in the past, so that was what was used. But what we then, following Mr. Brass's rebuttal, what we've done on that is saying, well, okay, well, let's bring it in line, and what does that do? So that is why we have changed it to a newer generation aircraft.
Yes, so you've accepted that criticism. In part, of course, it was technical things, that the aircraft would suffer weight restrictions and...
Yeah, we didn't accept it as a criticism. We took it as
I'm
a different
putting to
view.
you as a criticism. He was criticizing your fleet mix, and as you tell us, you've accepted that and you've amended your fleet mix.
Yes.
Thank you. And then the next one was the Boeing 777 type, which you had. Mr. Brass indicated that that was going to be heavily restricted by runway length, not able to carry full load or fuel because of length. No evidence that they're proposed by any airline. Your paragraph 2.2 in your further evidence, as I call it, you've also accepted that and removed that from your fleet mix.
Yeah, so when we put that in, it was also on the basis of what Mr. Brass had produced, suggesting there would be, for the earlier one, a North American route, and for the latter one, a Middle Eastern route. And so we put in Dubai as a logical one, and we put in Emirates, which also does operate weight-restricted 777s off other UK regional airports. They've done it out of Newcastle, for example.
Yes.
So hence, that's why we put it in there.
Yeah, and you've now taken it out.
We've taken that on board, and we've adjusted it accordingly.
And replaced it with a new generation aircraft, as with the last one.
Yes.
Yeah. Then, if I jump over one, I'll come back to 737-800, but the E195-E2 aircraft, you hadn't got any of those. Mr. Brass pointed out that KLM are likely to replace their E190s with E195-E2s, not, as you had assumed, 737-700s because of a KLM announcement, which, you know, was quite a widespread announcement. You must have been aware of it, I imagine.
So I wasn't aware directly of the KLM announcement, but then that's because I'm, dealing with many airlines and many, markets.
KLM's quite a big one, though, isn't it?
Not particularly.
KLM's not, Dutch national carrier's not big, okay.
Not in the grand scheme of the global markets. No.
And again, you've accepted the correction, haven't you?
Yes.
And you've removed that, and you've put in E195-E2s, a new generation aircraft.
Yes.
Then the next one that Mr. Brass dealt with was Lufthansa and the Lufthansa Announcement that they will start with E190s, not in your fleet mix. Again, in your paragraph 2.4, you now accept that correction as valid, as you say. You've increased those to Embraer 190s. That's not new generation, is it? But it's a turboprop aircraft.
It's not turboprop, it's a jet.
Jet, sorry, aircraft. And so you've made that correction. And then what you've done next, this is your paragraph 2.8, you say, as a result of some of the above-mentioned changes, there is an increase in the number of movements in some routes. For comparability, I've kept the total annual movements at 75,350, like the appellant's proposal. This has meant reducing other frequencies. So what you've then done is you've said, oh, I've added in all these new generation aircraft. You've then gone through other new generation aircraft and taken some out to get your numbers down.
What this is because we are trying to actually...
I know what it is.
Numbers. Yes. Yeah.
What you have done, having had to accept Mr. Brass's corrections, in order to get your new generation aircraft total down, what you then have done is go through other new generation aircraft and reduce the numbers.
No, that's not correct.
Well,
what we've
we
tried
can
to
look
do
at
is
it if you
match
want.
the overall numbers, but obviously that has implications on load factors and other things. So
Yes.
that's what we've done.
Let's not talk about load factors. What you have done in relation, I mean, we can see the numbers. You've reduced a number of the other numbers. So if we look, for example, at, I don't know, Airbus 320 Neos, they've gone down, new generation aircraft. Airbus 321 Neos, oh, you've pushed those down slightly. Boeing 737 MAX 8s, oh, they've gone down slightly. Because you've had to accept that some of the aircraft you got originally were wrong, what you then did in your redistribution was just knock off a bit of other new generation aircraft.
Now, well, also the other thing we have to account for the latest information is also the, we now have a clear indication
Yes.
of what Jet 2 have planned.
Did
and that has
you,
to go
I
on
know
as well.
about Jet 2, we'll come to Jet 2. Have you actually gone through and then knocked off?
No, we have not. What we have done is we have gone through, because we are trying to hit and meet that same number of movements as York Aviation has, it means that when we actually, change those aircraft to try and move in line with Mr. Brass, to see what really the implication that matters to us is what happens with particularly the Jet 2 side of things. By moving them around, we obviously have we will all, as James will have in his model and we will have in ours, we'll have differing assumptions on load factors, on seating sizes and others. So it's quite natural that we've had to do
Yes.
that, but it's not.
Yes,
that's
I'm not,
why we've done.
not arguing about whether something is natural or not natural, but when you were reducing those numbers, you had to lose some aircraft. I understand that because of load factors and other things. When you did it, what you did was knock off numbers of, you can see it in those columns, I've read them out to you.
Well, yeah, we did not knock them off. What we did is ran the model, and those are the numbers that came out of it.
Okay, so those all end up reducing. And then you came to Jet 2, the 737-800s. And what you say, what you did there is, Mr. Brass said that you're forecasting way too many 737-800s for Jet 2's proposed passenger numbers. And he pointed to Mr. Heapy's letter, which was a representation to the inquiry, which you tell us you weren't aware of.
No, we have modified once we saw the letter, but obviously
Yes.
prior to all the earlier
I know that
information
you
we did.
then saw the letter. As you tell us in your paragraph 2.5, I was not aware of the letter.
At
So,
the time.
well, obviously at the time,
Yes, but our
So-
new numbers are based on the letter.
yeah. So you were not aware of the letter originally. You then saw the letter, and Mr. Foley had said the letter is consistent, this was his evidence, with about 6,878 movements by 2027, but it could be more by 2030.
Yes, you would assume growth on what they've done in 2027.
What you have done, your paragraph 2.7, I assume you've taken this and then moved it forward to 2030, and you've got just under 9,000 movements. Yeah?
So, yeah, we have factored forward as part of that, assuming a growth profile that Jet2 coming into the market wouldn't just come in and just stop, you know, as they have with other markets, you expect them to grow.
Fully understand that, thank you. And so what do you then include in the table? So we have Jet2 at just under 9,000 movements with the 737-800. We look at the table, we've got 14,500 movements for that aircraft type. The number of movements has actually gone up. What you've done, because you've been forced by the corrections from Mr. Brass to increase the number of new generation aircraft, what you've then done in response, as I say, is slightly shaved down the numbers of other new generation aircraft, and then, based on an assessment that there would be just under 9,000 Jet2 aircraft, you've actually increased your total number of that aircraft of over 14,500.
Again, it's based on the fact of how Jet2 operate. Again, it's done through the model, through the load factors, through the passenger numbers.
Yes, but Jet2, you've told us in paragraph 2.8 are less than 9,000 movements. I mean, the plain fact is, I'll be absolutely straight with you, Mr. Foley, you've been forced through a number of errors in your original table, which you accepted, to increase the number of new generation aircraft. In order to sustain the point in your client's case that the fleet mix is wrong, you then just bumped up arbitrarily, with no evidence at all, the number of these older aircraft in order to have a noisier fleet mix.
Well, that is your view, but obviously we have been running our models and our numbers.
What is the evidence, having told us, whether or not we accept it, having told us that Jet2 would have less than 9,000 movements, why have you got over 14,500?
What we have done is, obviously, with the new numbers we had on Jet2's, plans and factoring that forward, that is why the numbers have increased how they have.
How did you get to 14.5? You told us that less than 9,000 Jet2.
Well, because there are also, other airlines that are still operating the 737-800.
As we discussed this morning, the models, the econometric models, are not looking at particular airlines, are they?
No, but when we did the fleet mix, as I said, it isn't just Jet2. You've also got Ryanair in there with those aircraft. You've got TUI in there with those aircraft as well. So it's not purely Jet2 that provide all of those numbers, but obviously they made a significant change with the amount of new aircraft routes and aircraft that they will put into the airport.
So we're now in the position in the table, the revised table, in your further evidence, your table 1, where you have changed, I think, every single number in the table from your original table. Not one number is the same.
Because of how we've run it through the model, and those are the outputs that come out. So when you change the variables, then that's what will happen.
And so far as I can see, there is no justification for that 14,000 figure. The closest you get to it is your paragraph 2.7, where you talk about just under 9,000. There's nothing. The inspector can read, reread, look at anything else. There's nothing, is there, about how you get to over 14,500. I mean, you're reading it very closely. You wrote it only a few days ago. I thought you would have known. There's nothing, is there?
So I'm just checking, but yeah, it's, as I said, with all the various assumptions we've made in there, that is what our model has generated.
And that, as you put it, is simply an assumption. Now, the result of that, and we can see it in that final pink line, is that our fleet mix had about 73% new generation. You were originally at 64%. Even with all these mysterious 737-800s that have apparently come from nowhere, you get to 67.6%. Although on Mr. Brass's correction of your figures, which was his rebuttal Appendix B, on that basis, if the inspectors wanted to look at your fleet mix, but without the mysterious thousands of 737-800s that you include, you would get to a percentage of 70% new generation. You see the figures?
Yes, that's his view, but with our view, having done the calculations, we reached 67.6.
Which, of course, is very much closer to Mr. Brass's own figures, isn't it?
It is closer, yes.
Yeah. And there's another interesting amendment you made in your paragraph 2.9. Sorry, not 2.9. 3.4. You correct some of the text, and two things I'll pick up. One is mundane, it's just a typo. In the first paragraph, in the penultimate line there, you say minus 2,271 movements, that is minus 4%. That should be 6%, shouldn't it?
I'm just trying to see that. Can't find that at the moment.
I think even your correction here needs a correction.
Yeah, I'm struggling to find that at the moment.
I'm sure you can come back to inspectors on that. I think if you look in your paragraph 3.3, look at your paragraph 3.3, look at your amended text there, look at the equivalent number and the percentage. 3.3 in your, the extra document, sorry, not your original proof.
Oh, I think I'm looking at the wrong one here. So.
We're on the penultimate paragraph of the additional, aren't we? Yeah.
Yeah.
On the additional one, okay.
The document we've been looking at.
Struggling to find what I need at the moment. I know it's one of these that I've been looking at. So,
Mr. Foley, I suspect you might be overcomplicating this.
yeah, I probably am.
It's
So which one?
that
This one?
document.
Yeah, so it's that one there.
I think it's just a typo in
It's
the
yeah, I think it's
penultimate.
nothing. That's why I said there are 2 points. One's, let's just get out of the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, it's minus.
It's a typo, but just so that the inspector knows what the correction.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah. It's minus 6. Okay. And that is.
I tell you what, Mr. Foley, let's pass on. It's a typo.
Well, I've noted it down as a typo. And
Okay,
if it's
we
not,
can double check.
let me
Yes.
know.
I just want to be
But
sure. on that.
slightly more interestingly, as well as changing the numbers, you also change the conclusion. So if we look at your original paragraph 8.9, so the very last page of your original proof, do you see it? And paragraph, sorry, I say 8.9, I have a terrible number dyslexia. It's 9.8.
Sorry, yeah, okay.
I have since childhood, and I reverse numbers. This was never a problem, save when I was a safety officer in a Royal Artillery regiment, and I was very worried about putting shells into small villages in Wiltshire. I never did. Well, see, I'm looking at the camera now. I didn't. 9.8, the little paragraph at the end there, these are significant differences. Look what the amended text says. These are now only material differences. So these are not now differences that are significant, are they? It's obviously a deliberate correction to your evidence.
It's a wording change. I mean, it can be
Yeah.
interpreted in many ways.
Well, of course, it can be interpreted in many ways. It's a quite deliberate change. You didn't need to change it, and you've changed it from significant, which has certain meaning, to something which is now just material.
Okay, well,
Sorry.
that's your view. I mean, significant
Well,
material.
why did you change it then?
I'm not certain why we would have changed it in that particular way, but obviously...
Did you write it?
Yes.
Well, when you say, I'm not sure why we would
Because
have done it, why did you do it?
sometimes when, we go back through documents, sometimes we change some of the words, and sometimes something flows and sounds better, and we'll change the words accordingly.
Oh, I hadn't realised it was stylistic. Well, the inspectors can
Yes.
see you deliberately change the language. All right. Now, in Section 8, you deal with impacts of the air traffic proof on other areas of evidence. And 8.2 and following, it's noise, and we've touched on this. 8.3, you say noise is likely to be higher than that assessed. Did you ever look at the contours that would be produced by your fleet mix?
So that was something that was done by our noise expert.
And does it fit within the contour cap?
On the details and the noise, I'm not sure.
Okay. If it doesn't fit within the proposed contour cap, then it's obviously not a fleet mix that could be flown, is it?
If a cap was put in place.
Well, a cap is proposed, isn't it? I think it's being discussed what it is between the parties. But can we agree that, assuming that the cap is put in place, your fleet mix could only be flown if it fitted within that cap, if it produced a contour that fitted within that cap?
It would need to try and fit in with that cap, but of course, as I said, there is often, in many cases, there are aircraft and there are movements that don't fit within the cap because of operational reasons.
No, there aren't.
Yes,
What are you
there are.
talking about?
Sorry, I might have misheard that. Could you just repeat
Yeah,
what-
so for example, as I said before, you may have a situation where you have, curfews and caps and things like that, but obviously with certain aircraft that are coming in, they can come in at different times, they could come in later than planned and so on, depending on things like winds and various other things. We see it at Heathrow, where aircraft arrive much earlier than they're actually supposed to within the regulations. So, it is something we have to be aware of.
All right. Well, if that's your only point, but the cap is there, isn't it, subject to a point about, for some reason, an aircraft arriving late, in order to cap the noise. And obviously, at the beginning of the scheduling season, when aircraft are types and numbers are being looked at, the airport and the airlines don't assume, do they, that their aircraft will be arriving late. They schedule on the basis that they will be arriving.
They will schedule on a schedule.
Yes, and therefore when they're scheduling, they will schedule so as not to breach the cap.
They will certainly try not to, yes.
Yes, okay. As far as air quality is concerned, as we agreed earlier, there's a strong correlation between noise and air quality, and therefore if a noise contour cap has controlled the type of aircraft, that will have a strong influence, won't it, on air quality from aircraft?
It should, yeah,
yes.
it should.
And ditto carbon, obviously, but for the economy, you say there's insufficient evidence to support the growth assumptions for business, but that just simply brings us back to this little table, doesn't it? And whether the inspector agrees with your 4-year trend, or our rather longer trend, and what the inspectors think about the collapse of BMI Regional in February 2019, and whether that has distorted the figures for one of the comparator years here.
Yep. And also the reality of the future of where we go forward post-COVID.
Yes. So overall, we can conclude, can't we, that for most, indeed nearly all areas of forecasting, you've agreed with the York forecast as being appropriate, subject to these very limited areas, the ones we've explored together.
Yeah.
Would that be fair?
I think it's fair. Yeah, there are many reasons in there why, as we've said, that we, do agree with the approaches on those things. So yes, there are a few items which we've discussed.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are many things in there where we do agree.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thanks very much. Is there any re-examination, Mr. Taylor?
So there is. I think I've got about 5 points. It shouldn't take very long, hopefully. Mr. Foley, we're going to start with that, with the question that you were asked about noise contours.
Yeah.
Now, as I understand the position, and can take you to the material if we have to, but Bristol Airport has applied to become a coordinated airport year-round at night, just for the nighttime period. And during the day, as I understand it, it proposes to operate as a schedules facilitated airport.
Right.
Now, you may not know the answer to this question, and if you don't, just say so. What ability is there to control, does an airport operator have to control the type of aircraft, and indeed when an aircraft lands and takes off in a schedules facilitated airport?
If I'm honest, I don't know the detail of how that is done.
Right, fine.
Without giving an answer where I may be, guessing, should we say. I'd
we'll
rather
move on.
be clear on that.
Thank you. Right, that was the first point. Second point. Now, this is about the fleet mix document that you were taken to. And a number of points were put. Let me just see if I can get it on my screen. Here it is.
Mr. Taylor, could you put your other microphone on, please?
Yes,
Just
of course.
thank you.
Sorry. It's because I'm moving around trying to look at the computer screen, but I'm not sure it'll make a huge amount of difference, but there we are. So you were asked a number of questions about the way in which your table has changed. And just so that we're clear, the output in the mix updated column, that is, are those numbers that you have deliberately and consciously tweaked in order to support a particular case, or are they the output of a model, or what?
They are the outputs of a model based on the new detail on the Jet 2 letter that were then inputted in.
Thank you. Now, you were asked some questions about the Boeing 737-800. You remember that? And if we look at your old fleet mix, you had 13,781 of that aircraft. And in the new one, you have some 14,582. So that's an increase of, what, around about 800 movements, 800 ATMs in a year.
Yeah.
So that's what? Around about 3 movements a day
Yes,
from that aircraft in addition. That's what we're talking about.
roughly. Yeah.
Okay. Now, operating from Bristol Airport, we've got TUI, Ryanair, EasyJet. Which of those operate 737-800s?
Ryanair and TUI.
Right. And when you were asked about, how do you get to the 14,582, you said, well, there's Jet2 and there's also other operators.
Correct.
And it was put to you, well, you haven't explained how you get there. So now we know we've got Jet2, we've got Ryanair and TUI. How do you get to the 14,582?
So there's a combination of all of those. So, all of those will be included in terms of their movements to get there. So it's not purely Jet2.
Thank you. All right, next, let's move on from that point. I'm on my third point now. Yeah. Do you remember when you were asked about elasticity? Yeah. It was put to you, well, you've not produced a new elasticity figure.
No.
Remember that?
Yep.
Now, the issue that you've raised about elasticity, and you've explained, is to do with the long-term implications of the change in technological familiarity. Yep. Post-COVID.
Yeah.
So we saw from the DFT document that the elasticities there were calculated and examined by reference to international passenger surveys.
Yes.
Yeah. Mr. Humphreys earlier in his questioning pointed out that travel is still restricted at the moment because of COVID.
Yes.
Right. So how could you undertake the surveys to get the data to be able to calculate the elasticity, given those travel restrictions are still in place?
Going forward, yeah. Well, you couldn't.
Right. So
Can you speak louder,
Sorry,
sir? I'm
sorry,
really
yes.
struggling. I know it's been a long
sat
session.
Back a little
yeah.
bit. Sorry, yes. It wouldn't be possible. It would be very difficult. And of course, you would be getting a sample size that is, very COVID restricted.
Right. So when Mr. Humphreys asks you and it says, well, you've not produced any data, how would it be possible to produce post-COVID data?
Well, at the moment, you couldn't do it with any confidence. That's the thing. We are still in that situation that, with so many uncertainties there, I would not feel comfortable and confident putting forward new elasticity going forward because, there simply isn't the data and the information to show what that would look like.
Okay, so you don't have that.
No.
But if you don't have that data, what does that mean about using the data based on 1984 to 2008 and continuing to use that as if COVID's never happened?
Then you would get results which would be wrong because you obviously wouldn't take into account COVID. So anything like that I would question very heavily. I would be very concerned about using that.
Thank you. point was put to you again in this context on elasticities that the latest Jet Zero consultation that came out, was it last week or the week before? All the weeks are merging into
Yes.
one at the moment for me. The DFT forecast had been used in that consultation process. That's
Yes.
what was put to you. What demand elasticities were used in that work? Have they explained that?
So I would assume that they are using the same DFT elasticities because there hasn't been a new study done to create new ones.
Right, you assumed that, but what have you actually seen in what they've published
believe it's-
about the work that they actually did on, in terms of the forecasts that they've used?
I believe they've used the same ones they already had.
Right, that's your belief, okay.
Yeah.
Fine, thank you. Sorry, one last point. I'll just check my reference. Yeah. In terms of the differences in relation to uncertainty between what you're saying and what Mr. Brass is saying, it was put to you, that the differences are effectively Jet 2 and also the elasticities point that we've just had some discussion about. If we turn to page 6 of your proof, please, paragraph 311. You say there that the result of the above, that's the section that you've set out in section 3, the decision maker in this appeal needs to take into account the extent of uncertainty associated with any proposal to expand the airport. Unfortunately, the environmental statements addendum do not appraise the environmental or economic impacts of the slow growth or fast growth scenarios. Now, and you say that the environmental and economic impacts that could arise may be materially different from those assessed. You see that?
Yes.
Now, it's put to you a number of times, and you agreed a number of times that there's no difference between you and Mr. Brass in terms of reaching 12 MPPA at 2030. But how do the slow growth or fast growth scenarios potentially otherwise affect the environmental or economic impacts?
Well, that's the thing, because we've said, in the discussions that we've talked about the core being the more likely scenario, and we've agreed that. But of course, we've pointed out those other scenarios are still highly relevant because there is that much more uncertainty at the moment. And so, even though we take a core as being the more likely one, it is important where these other scenarios can happen, and there is, a realistic possibility they could happen, that you need to obviously look at what that means across the whole piece and to understand what that might mean from an environmental and, environmental point of view or an economic point of view.
What, for example, are the implications of the fast growth scenario for a fleet mix?
So, for example, you could end up with more noisy aircraft earlier on, coming in the earlier years, for example. So the fleet mix can change.
And would the same be true of the fact that the fleet mix might change of the slow scenario too?
Absolutely, because it depends very much on the airlines and the markets that grow and the sectors that grow.
And so if you don't develop a fleet mix for those scenarios and you don't appraise their environmental impact, to what degree can you see the extent of uncertainty in terms of environmental impacts and indeed economic benefits?
And I think you're missing a significant amount of important research.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Fohn.
No, we've got nothing further, so thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now it's 10 to 3. We're now going to hear from the first XR witness, who I think is Mr. Capstick. So let's take a short break until 3:05, just to allow the witnesses to change over. So resume at 3:05, please. Right, it's 5 past. Let's resume. We've got Dr. Capstick on screen virtually, and if you were online just a few minutes ago, Dr. Capstick, I called you Mr. Capstick. My apologies, Dr. Capstick.
That's quite all right.
Right, then if I could turn over then to Ms. Beth. Yeah, perhaps if you do the double microphone, it seems to work. And if you can take your witness through his evidence. The evidence itself is comparatively brief. I don't know if you're proposing to get him to read through it or take him through it. Entirely up to you.
I'm proposing to take him through it, and we'll bring out the points we particularly want you to note. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Over to you.
Okay, so good afternoon, Dr. Capstick. You already confirmed who you are. So thanks for appearing as an expert witness for us. And if you'd just like to confirm, your proof of evidence is titled Social Attitudes and Impact on Flying, and deals with changes in social attitudes, particularly with regard to climate change, that are likely to impact demand for flying in the future. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so I believe you've been working on social attitudes to climate change for some time. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. So my earliest research in this area was in 2007 when I started looking at people's understanding of climate change and carbon footprints. I began my PhD in 2008 at Cardiff University. That itself was focused on changing public attitudes over time, drawing on several data sources to do that. And since I got my PhD in 2011, so for the past 10 years, I've been involved with and have led research on public attitudes towards climate change and behavioural and social responses to it. So in 2018, I was part of a team that set up a large 5-year research centre, the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, and I continue to be involved in research in this area.
Yeah, you are the Deputy Director of that centre, I believe.
That's correct, Deputy Director of the Centre and Research Fellow involved in various projects as part of it.
Thank you. So you mentioned that you've looked at changes over time in public attitudes. Have you noticed any changes in public attitudes towards climate change and society's response to it during this time, especially perhaps in recent years?
Yes, I have noticed changes both through my own research and other research that has looked at this. So to give a bit of kind of longer term context over the longer period of time for which there is data available, which goes back to kind of the 1990s, I think it's fair to say that people's concern about climate change, attitudes to climate change, has tended to wax and wane and to fluctuate. And this is connected to several factors to do with economics, politics, media reporting, cultural shifts, changes in the weather, and so on. And I published a systematic review looking at changes in attitudes and some of the reasons behind that back in 2014. And so obviously that could only look at trends up to that point. You mentioned more recently, and more recently there has been a different phenomenon that we have seen in our research. Really the past 2 to 3 years, I would say, where we have seen a new and unprecedented growth in concern and awareness about climate change among the wider public. So that's risen to new levels. It's reflected in our research and that of other social survey organisations such as Ipsos, YouGov, and others. So back in 2019, I think it was mid-2019, YouGov found that concern for the environment among the public was at record highs that had not been seen before, and that people felt this was one of the most important issues facing the country.
Thank you. And so you're basing a lot of your evidence on social surveys and attitudinal surveys. Can you be sure these social services are robust and unbiased?
Yes, we take a lot of care to do so. So when we carry out our surveys of the public, we make sure they're representative of the British population, according to gender, age, region of the country, socioeconomic status. So that means essentially that the people who fill in our surveys reflect the wider population on those criteria. So we generally survey around 1,000 people in our surveys. That might not sound a lot in comparison to a population of 60 million, but it means that statistically we can be confident that any findings say that 50% of people hold a particular view is accurate to within around a 3% margin of error. So in other words, if you were to go out and find another 1,000 people, you would almost certainly get a figure within that range. In terms of our surveys, the questions we ask, they're designed to be simple and straightforward, so they can be answered without the risk of confusion or ambiguity. We do tend to put our findings out in briefing papers before they've been peer reviewed, so that we can get them out there. But our research goes through peer review. I've personally had many studies published in peer reviewed journals drawing on this sort of data. And I would also say that, you know, part of the reason for doing these surveys is we often don't know how the findings are going to come out, and so, you know, we will put questions out there with a view to finding out what the current public attitude is.
Thank you very much. So if we move on now to section 3 of your proof, where you're detailing questions in public attitude surveys that your centre has undertaken on limiting air travel and stopping airport expansion. So you might want to talk about these surveys a bit, but can I ask, did the results of these surveys surprise you?
Yes, they did actually. I have been surprised, well, both in terms of the sorts of finding I just talked about, that's very recent and large growth in public concern, but in terms of, particularly in relation to air travel and airport expansion, I have been genuinely surprised by the extent to which people support limiting flying and limiting airport expansion. So in the proof, so you referred to section 3. So in the proof, I highlighted 2 studies. One of these was a survey carried out by colleagues in the CAST Centre that I wasn't directly involved with, but people I work with. And this asked people whether they supported or opposed to a halt to airport expansions. And that research found that around 3 times as many people supported, so were in favour of stopping airport expansion compared to the proportion that opposed this. So it was 45% supported a halt to expansion compared to 17% who opposed this. And then you have the remaining either or don't know responses. And in that same survey, my colleagues found that around 4/5 of people in the UK from our sample felt that we either should definitely or probably limit the amount of air travel we do in order to tackle climate change. And of the remaining responses, only about 14% of people said we either don't really need to do that or we don't need to do that at all. And I think it's worth mentioning that the large proportion of people that we find saying that we need to limit the amount of air travel we do is comparable to other survey research. So a piece of work in 2019 that I was involved with, where we found then that about 2/3, 67% of people said we should definitely or probably limit air travel. So I think the point I would want to draw from these surveys is that there is now a widespread recognition among the public, or review, shall we say, that as a society we need to limit air travel, and that the structural conditions should reflect that in terms of not expanding airports.
Thank you. And would I be right that at least one of those studies was done pre-COVID?
Gosh, how long has this been going on for? The 2019 study was, yes, the summer of that period, yes. So this is, I mean, actually one of the surprising things about the research is the extent to which the public concern about climate change and these other factors have persisted through the pandemic. So we might have expected, or some might have predicted, that with so much other things to worry about, that it would decline, but we're finding very persistent concern about climate change among the public.
Thank you. So, and just to move on, you also undertook another survey that I think asked people to choose up to 3 options from a list of 8 personal actions that could be taken to tackle climate change. So were there some clear results from this survey?
Yes, there were some clear distinctions between the types of actions people identified. So this is the October 2020 survey again that colleagues carried out. And what was asked in that was, if it was a sort of a propositional statement, if everybody in the UK did the following, which would have the biggest impact on tackling climate change? And people were, the survey respondents were given a range of options. They could pick up to 3. I won't go through all the options, but these covered things like all in one bundle, walk, cycle or use public transport, eat less red meat, drive an electric car, and then among the options there was minimise air travel. And we found in that survey, or rather my colleagues found, that people perceived walking, cycling and using public transport to have the biggest perceived impact. So 47% of people picked this. But in joint second place out of the 8 options, 42% of people selected minimising air travel. And again, what I think this shows is that the perception of the need to minimise air travel and the value of this for tackling climate change is now firmly on the public's radar as something that they feel is necessary and impactful.
Thank you. And that was figure 2, just after paragraph 3.3 on your proof, I think.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. And, I mean, was this what you were expecting as a response?
I do think I have been surprised at the extent to which kind of aviation flying has sort of penetrated the public consciousness. I think, you know, my sense is that a few years ago we wouldn't have seen that so strongly, and that awareness and concern has grown. Now, I have to be a little careful because some of our questions we've asked over the last sort of 2 or 3 years, so we can't always directly compare them to 10 years ago, but I wouldn't have expected these results, say, 5 or 10 years ago, when the sort of public discourse was much more around what has been called in the literature simple and painless actions, things like recycling, switching off phone chargers, that sort of thing. So there's been a shift in perspective. But in any case, yes, I was surprised when we did do this work that the strong links that people were making between climate change, action on climate change, and limiting flying.
Thank you. So you've also considered the NAT survey, that's the National Air Travel Service survey from Ipsos Mori. You've considered it for 2019 and 20. I believe Mr. Brass considered it just for 2019. So it's a survey on public attitudes to aviation and a particular question within that survey. Now, I wanted to firstly just read that question to you and ask if you could give some comments on it. So the question asked of people was, I don't think people should be discouraged from flying if they want to, even if this might have a negative impact on the environment. Is that a good question to ask?
Not particularly. Not particularly. I would have to say that this is not a very well phrased question. We included it in the proof as it focuses specifically on people's perceptions of priorities for aviation, so it seems very relevant. But yes, as you say, the question, people are asked to disagree with, asked to either agree or disagree with that statement. The trouble with, and you have to be very careful with survey questions, the trouble with questions like this is that it's already kind of a double-barreled question, which has got a conditional statement within it, the even if part. And so effectively, if you disagree with that statement, you end up with a double or even triple negative. You end up disagreeing that you don't think that people should be discouraged, even if, you see what I mean? So it's not an ideal survey question, but yeah.
Yeah. But people did manage to answer it, didn't they? And
yeah.
What results did you find from that in both? What's reported in both surveys?
Well, I mean, again, we have to be a little bit careful with 2 data points, but there was a pretty big shift between 2019 and 2020. So in 2019, 47% of people agreed that I don't think people should be discouraged from flying. But in 2020, which is, of course, the more recent year, that dropped to 34%. And that 34% of people who felt that people shouldn't be discouraged from flying is equivalent, is the same within a margin of error as the 32% who disagreed. So what I would take from that is that the most recent data from NATS on this question says that as many people disagree as agree that people should or shouldn't be discouraged from flying. So there's some ambivalence there, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so also in section 4 of your proof, at paragraph 4.3, you consider surveys of public attitudes to airport expansion and public attitudes to reducing aviation emissions. So do these surveys show change over time? And
yes, so this is the from other survey items asked by NATS and Ipsos Mori. Some questions were asked 1 or 2 or 3 years, but yeah, there were other questions asked in there. So people were asked whether they agreed or disagree that airport expansion is the right thing to do, was how that was phrased. So in 2020, again, the most recent data, 39% of people, so about 2/5, agreed that, so supported expansion in as much as it was the right thing to do, but that was down from 57% in 2019. And again, you know, that's a pretty big drop from 2019 to 20 in terms of support for expansion. There was other questions in 4.3 as well I could touch on.
you had something on reducing emissions there, and public attitudes
Yes.
to emissions in aviation.
Correct, yes. So the other question that the NATS research asked in this case in 2018, 19 and 20 was about priorities for aviation. And you can see in figure 4 in the proof, this shows that people prioritise the industry, the airline industry, reducing emissions to a very large and growing extent. So just over 50% of people see this as a priority in 2018, about 60% in 2019, 70% in 2020. And I think it's important to contrast that with the proportions of people who see increasing airport capacity as a priority. So that's under 25% in 2018, and it falls to under 20% of people seeing this as a priority in 2020. So it's a small decline, but from an already sort of small starting point. And again, the thing I would take from this is that overall, people are placing much more priority on the industry reducing emissions than on increasing capacity. And I noted as well here that actually in the report from NATS itself, they comment that there has been, quote, a sea change in public attitudes about aviation and the environment. So I think this is something that's recognised more widely, and I would say that would seem to run counter to the idea that kind of post-pandemic growth in demand will simply return to its previous trajectory.
Thank you. Okay. So turning to comments you made about a Swedish phenomena, flight shaming. So there have been suggestions that this actually wasn't about people feeling ashamed of flying, it was about them not wanting to pay extra taxation. Would you agree with that?
Well, first of all, I'd say that the Flugskam, if that's how you do pronounce it, I've been reliably informed means flight shame. So we should be clear, this isn't about shaming people deliberately. This is a kind of uncomfortable experience people have. In terms of your substantive question about taxes versus flight shame, no, I don't see why this would be either or. Of course, prices and costs, taxes, etc., do influence people's choices, but we're also very much creatures of our society, our culture, and what seems socially desirable or conversely frowned upon. So I disagree that flight shame had nothing to do with reduced flying in Sweden at the end of the 2010s. Now, in terms of kind of trying to pinpoint an effect, there is some research by WWF in Sweden, which found that a quarter of people stated in 2019 that they avoided air travel because of its climate impact. So in my view, this is a real phenomenon that has affected people's inclination to fly, and it more generally points to the importance of social attitudes and norms there. So that's Sweden. In the UK, there's some suggestion that this phenomenon may be present too, but I think it speaks to what may be changing social attitudes. So until very recently, flying is something that's been seen as widely supported by social norms, desirable, acceptable, but again, it's back to that Nat's work of saying there has been a sea change in public attitudes. There is a shift underway, I would say.
And I think I may be right in saying that the idea of avoiding flying actually hit the charts in Sweden. Am I right?
Yes, a colleague in Sweden, Kimberly Nicholas, who studies these things and speaks Swedish. There's a very popular singer in Sweden called Veronica Maggio, and she has released a song called Nu stannar vi på marken, which means now we stay on the ground, and it's to encourage overland rather than air travel, and it has had, I think it's been out about a month, and it's had a million listens on Spotify, which, given it's in Swedish, that's probably mostly people. So, I think these, on the one hand, it's maybe seems slightly frivolous, but it does speak to the fact that this is a widespread and far-reaching sort of cultural phenomenon.
Thank you. So moving on to the section of your proof that talks about business travel. You refer to research on attitudes to business travel and research actually done before and during the pandemic. Now, my understanding is, correct me if I'm wrong, that Cohen et al. Before the pandemic did some survey of businesses and their attitude to travel. Is that right?
Yes, well, it was actually an analysis of discussions in forums and online kind of discussions. So they tried to look at how business travellers were talking. It was a sort of a different approach to understanding people's perspectives and attitudes. But yes, that was what they tried to do. They looked at the different slants, perspectives business travellers had on flying. They found some people loved it and enjoyed travel, but they did identify kind of a segment of business travellers who at that point, so this is 2017, or at least that's when the research was published, so it may have been sooner, they wished to reduce their travel, but they saw it essentially as beyond their control because of an expectation from their company or a general expectation they would fly. So there was that intention, that willingness to fly less among a section of the business community.
Okay, thank you. Could you say that was a majority of the business community or just a few, or?
I wouldn't want to hazard a guess on that. I'm not sure if that was quantified or not, to be honest with you. But I think what it shows is that, particularly with how sort of practices have changed during the pandemic, that there will be a section of business and businesses themselves who are not keen to go back to the way things were before. So another study cited in there from Gosling and others, 2020, which was produced during the pandemic. They talk a lot about the phenomenon that we're all very familiar with now. I'm talking to you via video conferencing. And they talk about how video conferencing has now become more widely adopted than ever before for business and study, and suggests that at this point it was months of these new work arrangements. It's now a year and a half or something after a very long time of these work arrangements, that many organisations and workers will perceive benefits, at least of some partial retention of those sorts of measures. Now, I did try to be clear in the proof there is uncertainty about the extent to which some of these patterns of work, including international travel, will return, but I think the thrust of several studies is that norms and practices have changed and that not everybody actually wants them to return to the way they were before.
Thank you. And just to summarise, so the Gosling et al. Research done, published anyway in 2020, would it be right to say that that did find an intent anyway among business travellers to continue to at least reduce the amount of travel they do when times change?
It wasn't a study of business traveller attitudes, so I don't. That's probably not quite the right way of phrasing that.
Okay. Okay. I mean, it has been said that business travel falls back in each recession, and there's always speculation that it won't recover, but it always does. Do you see anything different about the likely COVID effect on business travel?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting point about kind of comparing prior recessions, or the most recent recession, to COVID. My view is that all we've really seen is, over time, is business travel rebounding once, and that's following the 2008-9 financial crisis, with possibly a smaller bump in the 1990s, when, of course, there was much less air travel anyway. So we've only really had two major recessions in the UK in recent decades, 2008-9 in the early 90s. So what I would say is we're only really able to say that flying rebounded after the 2008-9 recession. Now, how comparable is that to COVID? Personally, I would say that this was a completely different phenomenon to the 2008-9 financial crisis. You know, most of us have never seen anything like COVID before and the disruption it's caused. So it's very different to a recession in terms of the level and the length of disruption to everything, for everyday life, almost everything we do. So COVID is not a recession. Of course, it has hit economic activity, but it's not itself a recession. And I think what's important to bear in mind is that this has been an unprecedented disruption to many aspects of our lives and working practices. And the thing, and this comes back to the video conferencing, the reason this matters is because it is reconfiguring many sort of previously taken for granted ways of doing things. So we know, it's been covered a lot in the news, that many companies are reconsidering the need for staff to be in their office all the time, or even for office space at all, having learnt out of necessity it was possible to work differently. And our own research in CAST finds that among the people who are able to work from home, many wish to retain many of their changed practices. So I think, for me, this puts quite a question mark over whether businesses will need or want to undertake as much air travel in future when there are alternatives they've learned to use. Now, that's not to say there won't be some rebound, of course, but I don't think the 2008-9 recession is necessarily the best guide of what we're going through now.
Okay, thank you. And just to say that also in this section, you refer to several attitudinal studies that find more people planning to fly less after COVID restrictions are lifted than propose to fly more. You did mention that intentions do not always translate into behaviour. I mean, is there really any link? Can you say anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that people's attitudes are only one factor that influences their choices and behaviours. There are many other influences upon how we live our lives, of course: cost, convenience, lack of choice, and so on. But the main psychological models of environmental behaviour and behaviour in general include attitudes as one of a small number of reliable predictors. And so attitudes, although they are not everything, they are an important and significant predictor of what people actually do. And there are other variables as well, other factors as well, which are important for determining behaviour that are relevant here, that include things like personal ascription of responsibility for action, which essentially connects people's wider awareness of issues with their own sense of responsibility for acting. And again, in the context of action on climate change and flying, we would expect that would influence behaviour. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And so, just to finish up really with a few questions. Yeah, I thought you might need a water break. Yeah. So in your closing remarks, you refer to induced demand, a concept accepted in highway planning, whereby if you build a new road, you're likely to create a bit more traffic. Is there any evidence that this could also apply to other infrastructure provision, including airports?
Yeah, I think there is some evidence, although it is more limited, certainly for aviation than for road travel. But there has been some work published this year by a transport researcher called Giulio Mattioli, looking at UK practices. And he and his colleagues looked at a wide range of factors influencing people's use of air travel. And what they found was that how close people lived to an airport, what they called airport accessibility, influenced the extent to which they used it, even after taking into account many other predictors such as income, international connections, etc. And I think this matters because it challenges the idea, the really sort of core idea that demand for aviation is some kind of abstract thing that just solely comes from people's preferences and wishes that already exist. It's something inevitable that will just happen. And if I could be sort of slightly anecdotal for a moment, I live in Bristol. When I go on the web on my phone, I regularly see adverts offering me £30 flights from the airport. I'm being encouraged / induced to do that. The £30 flights don't exist because I want them. They're created at least in part in order to create that demand. So that's induced demand. So I think that the published research suggests that that accessibility of air travel to people, and one might say by extension increasing that accessibility, is something that would drive demand. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. The UN report you were involved with suggested that improving alternative surface transport or surface transport alternatives to aviation could help to tackle climate change. I mean, would this be a way to remove the induced demand of airports and airport expansion?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to be clear that sort of dealing with induced demand is not about unnecessarily restricting people, but in my own view, it's important to enable sort of cheaper and convenient alternatives to flying, to taking those alternative overland options where possible. Now, the UN report was an international report, so it covered things in a sort of broad brush terms, but I think this applies particularly to domestic travel. That there are alternatives, and if I may stray briefly into the topic of climate change, there are alternatives to domestic travel, particularly in near distance travel, than the kind of high carbon flying.
Okay, so you wouldn't see measures to deal with induced demand as undemocratic then?
No, I wouldn't see this as undemocratic. I think decisions are taken all the time by governments, councils, businesses, etc., that influence people's choices one way or the other. So over the border in Wales, the government there has just taken the decision not to build any more roads because of the climate emergency. France has taken the step of restricting domestic air travel for the same reason. There will be in the UK a ban on the sale of petrol and diesel cars from the year 2035. And I don't think any of those things are undemocratic, and likewise I don't think that limiting airport expansion is undemocratic. Sort of any more than, not building roads is undemocratic because people can't drive on a road that wasn't built. So that doesn't really make sense to me. I would also say as well, maybe this has come up in the inquiry already, but that if what we're talking about really in terms of this sort of idea about being undemocratic, if what we're really talking about is people's freedom of choice, the UK has the highest rate of flying in the world. We fly more than any other country. So I would suggest that COVID aside, there are currently very few restrictions on how much flying people can do. And if I may just briefly say as well, I think this is part of the relevance of doing the sort of social surveys that we do, and when we ask people about views on limiting flying or limiting airport expansion, and that's that people recognise and understand the relevance of things taken at that sort of structural systemic level that enable or constrain certain choices. And so people will often emphasise the need for government and industry to make low carbon lives possible, and yes, to limit unsustainable practice. So that's how I would understand the view of close to half of the British public that airport expansion should be stopped.
Okay, Dr. Capstick, thank you very much. I have no more questions. Do you feel you've done your proof of evidence justice? I certainly do.
Well, I mean, I don't want to talk more than I'm welcome to. I suppose there was one other thing just to touch on, and this was about intentions for the future. And that, you know, we are not post-pandemic yet. There is very uncharted territory in front of us, but both research by the CAST Centre and Ipsos Mori has found that when people are asked, will you fly more for holiday or leisure than you did before COVID, there are more people who say they plan to fly less in future compared to more. And I think this speaks to how, you know, that there's a whole field of psychology on this, how disruption and crisis can kind of make us reconsider how we do things.
Thank you very much. I'll hand you back to the inquiry now.
Right, thanks very much, Ms. Beth, and thank you, Dr. Capstick. It may be that Mr. Humphreys has got some questions for you.
Yes, Dr.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. My colleagues have reminded me. I wonder if you could try moving your microphone up a bit, Dr. Capstick.
Oh, sorry, is it a bit quiet?
Might help a bit, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, Mr. Humphreys.
Dr. Capstick, can you hear me and see me?
Yes, I'm sorry if my sound was a bit low. I can see and hear you fine.
Great. Dr. Capstick, are you happy to answer a few questions from me?
Yep.
Thanks. A lot of your paper, in particular in section 3, where you get onto public perceptions surveys, a lot of that data is in what I think you call CAST briefing paper 8. It's actually in your footnote 1. You referred to it. I don't think it's a core document in this inquiry, but I've obviously got it, and indeed I've got all the other CAST briefing papers. Now, you refer there to one of the sets of questions in that CAST briefing paper. It's on page 3 of the paper. The inspectors don't have it, but we can get it put in if necessary. And this is the one where you asked people about limiting the amount of air travel. Do you recall it? I suspect you've got the paper or you can have access to it.
Yes.
And there were 4 questions, and that one was slightly different from all the others, wasn't it? All the others asked about reducing the amount of things, reducing the amount of energy, or reducing the amount of consumption of certain things, or reducing the amount of meat in our diets. But the one question on aviation was different. It asked about limiting the amount of air travel or flying that we do. Now, I don't know whether this is the full question, but limiting to what? Limiting to 25% more than now, or 50% more than now, or what was the limit that people were responding to?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point that there's a different wording there. I think what we have to take from people's responses to questions like that, and bear in mind that the answers were very clearly in the...
Dr. Capstick, just to cut across you there,
sorry.
I want to get you to focus on my question. Were the 1,000 or so people surveyed told what the limit was, whether it was a limit as current, a limit 20% more, 50% more? Was any limit identified?
No, this is about a general attitude, belief that we should be limiting the amount of air travel we do, which you might, the flip side of that is not doing more of it.
And in that set of surveys, there weren't, as I understand it, looking through it, results about whether people themselves were actually going to fly less.
Yes, there were. So that was what I touched upon towards the end of Miss Beth's questions there.
Is that in CAS briefing paper 8, or is that in one of the other surveys? I'm just asking you.
Yeah. I think it may be in one of the other CAS briefing
Okay,
papers.
so in CAS briefing paper 8, there's nothing about asking people whether, they might be in favour of limiting, we're not quite sure what that means, but limiting, but we didn't ask them, are you going to fly less in that set of surveys?
No, but we have asked that in other research, and people have said they intend to fly less in future. More people say that than say they will want to fly more.
So there's another CAS briefing paper 7, which was about universities and climate change. And in that one, you don't ask students. For example, I think 25% of Cardiff University students are overseas students. You didn't ask them whether they were willing not to fly to or from university.
No, that's because that is not what that research was about. That was research by a colleague, Claire Houlihan, who was interested in, at a strategic level, what universities were trying to do, the HE sector was trying to do about flying, and in this case food as well.
And one of the outcomes, if I can sort of summarize, is that most universities weren't actually doing all that much.
I would say it's work in progress. So my university, Cardiff, we set up a climate emergency working group after having declared an emergency. That has morphed into a net zero panel. We have provided recommendations and a white paper which are currently being considered by the university's management. And part of that is about limiting, if I can use that word, academic travel and rethinking the kind of business model for student travel as well.
My understanding from that paper and the other things from CAS that I've looked at, you haven't said, right, we should have a target of no more than 10% overseas students.
Targets are under discussion. I mean, I don't have them at my fingertips, but universities are talking, and Manchester University as well, Cardiff University, are talking about what sort of targets are appropriate for reducing staff travel, student travel.
Yes, the amount of travel, but not reducing the number of students from overseas or staff from overseas.
Probably not, no.
No. All right. CAS briefing paper 8 on page 4 makes an important point. It says, given the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions on long-distance travel, reported behaviours and views on air travel need to be interpreted with caution. I'll come to the next sentence in a moment, but of course a lot of the surveys that you're relying on are ones undertaken during the pandemic, and that general advice that the results need to be interpreted with caution is correct, isn't it, for a number of these surveys?
Yes, and I think the situation we find ourselves in now are very uncertain times. You know, I don't think anybody, whether they're a psychologist or a surveyor or a forecaster, has a crystal ball. These are unprecedented circumstances. So I think that sentence there, which I didn't write, but which I think is very sensible, is to say that we do need to interpret this with caution, that there is a lot of uncertainty about how things might change going forward. But if that uncertainty points in any particular direction, it is towards people being more concerned about climate change than they ever have been, and recognising that link with air travel in a way they haven't in the past.
The next sentence is interesting as well, bearing in mind the proportion of the UK population that flies in any year, that 2/3 of our samples, 75%, reported that they would have taken more flights in the last 12 months if the pandemic had not happened. In other words, bearing in mind that some people wouldn't expect to have flown in the last 12 months anyway, I mean, they might have flown in the 12 months before that, that's actually a
Sure.
very high percentage, isn't it, of people who are indicating not, you know, a wish or an aspiration, but they would have wanted to fly.
I guess what that would say to me is that had the pandemic not happened, then yes, I might well have flown. So yeah, I mean, clearly, when this survey was undertaken in October 2020, we were in the second lockdown. I mean, very few people were flying anywhere. So I don't think it's surprising that people would have flown were those conditions not in place.
But it slightly cuts across, doesn't it, the thing you quote on page 5 of the CAST briefing paper, which is the statement which you produce, when asking about specific policies to reduce travel-related emissions, almost half the survey respondents expressed support for stopping airport expansion, 45%. What we see there with those two figures is this mismatch between people, on the one hand, saying, yes, oh, there shouldn't be airport expansion, but on the other hand, making it very clear that they themselves intend to fly.
No, I don't think there is a mismatch there. I think that one question is about might you have flown were there not these restrictions in place? The other one is a question which, as I suggested in response to Ms. Beth's questions, is about people's understanding that the choices we make, whether that's driving, flying, etc., are at least as much determined by the structural conditions, such as accessibility of air travel. So we always find people want government and industry to act at least as much, usually more than individuals do, and so I think it's entirely in line with that.
Yes, with respect though, Dr. Capstick, that is a gloss that you have put on the answer. The question didn't ask all those things, did it? That's just,
I wouldn't call it a...
So we need to distinguish, don't we, between the evidence of what people actually said in the survey, on the one hand,
Sure.
and, you know, perfectly properly as an individual, your interpretation of what that might mean, which might be different to someone else's.
Okay, well, if I may, so if we want to stick to just the bare question there, we have 45% of people supporting stopping airport expansions, substantially more than oppose that. We could stop there and say we don't necessarily know all the reasons underpinning that, but my experience and research over the past almost 15 years in being involved in many research studies is that a recurrent finding is that people want the conditions to be put in place to be able to live in a low carbon way. And I think that's actually a fairly sensible thing to want, because, you know, our choices are constrained or enabled depending on the conditions we find ourselves in.
Doesn't that then bring us to the Ipsos Mori survey for NATS, National Air Traffic Services? Now, you've referred to this. We've got it in Mr. Brass, the witnesses, in his Appendix 2 at page 55. Do you have access to that? I don't want to...
I did have.
Don't worry. So it should be Mr. Brass, his proof of evidence. There's an Appendix 2, and within the appendix there's a page 21, 22, which is the NAT survey that you were talking about.
Yep. Okay. So, what page is that? Sorry.
In the appendix, it's page 22.
22.
So the appendix.
Yeah. I think I have that. If that is the question with.
That's the people. You know, people warmer towards. Yeah.
Yep. Got it.
So on page 22, and again, rather illustrates this point. So on page 22, we can see there's a paragraph with a couple of bullet points below it. People warmer towards airport expansion and support reform of flight paths more agree than disagree that airport expansion in the UK is the right thing to do. 57% up from 48%. So more people agree with airport expansion than disagree. And then by a margin of nearly 7-1, the public support changes to flight paths. That's a slightly different point. And then I'm just going to read the next things so that we can all be have the same text, and I'll just ask you about it. They prioritize the environment, but are cool on disincentives and personal impacts. 3 in 5 think reducing emissions should be the priority for the aviation industry, an increase since 2018, and almost double the second most mentioned priority, reducing noise. However, comparatively few are willing to change their own behavior. Now 38%, they would be willing to pay a charge or a levy when booking a flight to help protect the environment. 32% say they wouldn't, although this is up from 30% in 2018. Smaller proportion willing to accept more noise, that's a different topic. And by a margin of more than 2-1, the UK public do not believe people should be discouraged from flying if they want to, 47% against 22%. So, you know, a big majority, even if this might have a negative impact on the environment. And you touched on this earlier with Ms. Beth, but if we're going to look at the surveys, it's appropriate, isn't it, that we look at that, and that does, again, I suggest you sort of illustrate this point that people have aspirational views generally, but when it comes to their own behavior, is very often very different indeed.
Well, I would like to make a point of clarification, if I could. I think I'm correct in saying that that page of the appendix and the data shown there are from 2019, when those numbers were rather higher than in 2020, which is the more recent work. So I think I'm correct in saying that that question, I don't think people should be discouraged from flying, dropped to 34% in 2020. So it was, you know, so this should be in our proof of evidence. So, I mean, there's quite a wide fluctuation there over the years, isn't there? But and this partly speaks to the problem with the question. But you know, my view is that the most recent data in 2020 shows a wider public ambivalence, and so our proof does include 2020 as well as the 2019.
I know, but remember the caution in CAST briefing paper 8. Given the ongoing COVID pandemic and the restrictions on long-distance travel, reported behaviours and public views on air travel needed to be interpreted with caution. Those are your own, your centre's words, and Dr. Capstick, with respect, I've put to you something which is slightly pre-pandemic so that we can get, if you're not a non-lockdown view, you've put to me a pandemic view. I then put back to you the fact that you yourselves tell us we should treat that with caution. And we should, shouldn't we?
I don't think there's anything wrong with treating data with caution, particularly if we are looking to make forecasts from it, and particularly if we're looking to make forecasts from something in very unprecedented and uncertain times. The point I take from this is that these recently changed public attitudes towards climate change and flying, to my mind, cast a lot of uncertainty about assumptions on future demand. And I would say, you mentioned aspirations, if I may comment there. There's a figure, it's not actually labelled, it's a figure under figure 2. You know, of course there are people who have aspirations to fly on holiday, but we find more people disagree that they have the aspiration to fly on holiday at least once a year. So yes, whilst we would expect to always see people flying, etc., I think we should take that with caution as well.
Yes. You also cautioned us about a second thing, which was sort of the framing of the question. You did it in relation to the next question, but in your figure 2, which is just below paragraph 3.3, this is the one about reducing air travel. That again comes from CAST briefing paper 8, page 2. And in the briefing paper it says, respondents were asked to pick 3 actions from a list of 8 which they thought would have the biggest impact on climate change if everybody in the UK implemented these changes. So a number of double-barrel things there. First, there's a precondition that if everybody in the UK was going to implement these things, and then they're not asked there about their own behavior or what they think is right, they're asked a theoretical question of what do they think would have the biggest impact. Now, you know, actually, that's a factual thing. They're either right or they're wrong. I mean, for example, eat less meat was quite low, whereas we all know that agriculture is one of the biggest contributors to carbon, to climate change. So one looking at that figure 2 and those results, again, one needs to treat them with a fair degree of caution, I would have thought.
Well, I think we need to treat them with caution, but I think that the basic point stands, which is that there is now widespread recognition of the relevance of aviation and minimising aviation, both at the national level and the personal level, in order to tackle climate change. Now, we often ask people about their perceptions of things which you might argue have factual underpinnings, but what this figure says to me is that people now recognise the relevance of aviation and minimising travel.
Indeed. Then section 4 is on social tipping points. And again, if I may say so very fairly, you say, look, it's difficult to make strong claims, but you do go on then to talk about Sweden and flight shame, and Mr. Brass did point out that the slight inflection in the numbers of flights in Sweden does happen to coincide with the imposition of an aviation tax in Sweden. We've been discussing this morning, you may not have been listening to it, elasticities of demand and the relationship between, you know, price and cost and people's willingness to fly. So the first thing I think we can agree is that certainly that too would be an explanation for a change in the pattern of numbers of people flying in Sweden.
I am not familiar with what's happened with taxation in Sweden, but if things get more expensive, notwithstanding questions around elasticity, then yes, you will expect some change there. But again, as I said to Ms. Beth, I don't think this is an either-or issue.
But if we bring it back to the UK, your figure 3, which is part of this same social tipping point, and you produce some data there from Carbon Independent on domestic passenger air travel over time, which appears to show in 2019 a fall off in domestic flights. Now, I haven't checked that data. I don't know whether it's CAA data or who Carbon Independent are, but let's assume that it is correct for just current purposes. Do you again have Mr. Brass's proof of evidence with you?
I do, yes.
If you could just turn to page 21.
Yep.
If we look at figure 6 there, which is a slightly longer data set, but also ending in 2019, what we see is that passenger numbers at Bristol continue to rise quite sharply over the period in your figure 3, 2012 to 2019. So if you are correct and that domestic passenger numbers are falling, what that tells us, if that was replicated at Bristol, is that international flights are disproportionately increasing because the overall numbers have gone up. Yes?
Potentially, it would depend on what is happening at other airports, but potentially.
Well, just look at Bristol. If Bristol has gone up overall, if your point is, look, because of flight shame, domestic passengers are going down, the implication at Bristol is, of your point, is that international flight numbers are going up disproportionately. Now, that is not consistent, is it? People taking longer flights, consistent with flight shame, certainly in the UK.
No, I mean, I think I think you may be piecing together several things here that don't necessarily belong to be pieced together. So this figure 3 in the proof is national 12-month rolling total. Bristol Airport shows increase in flights overall up to 2019, and most of what we deal with in the proof is about very recent shifts in public attitudes. Now, with the sort of flight shame phenomenon, there's a couple of things here. One was that we were picked up on, in Sweden, not Bristol, Sweden. Is there an argument that this may have influenced flying? And I think there is an argument. In the UK, where perhaps the flight shame phenomenon is not as salient, we may not have seen such a strong effect of that. But I don't think it undermines the argument that people's attitudes and intentions have changed in recent years, and that will create some real uncertainty in future trajectories of demand. And
you then move on in your paragraph 4.3 to make a more general point that NAT's research shows that air traffic levels seem unlikely to return to 2019 levels for years. But of course, that's entirely consistent with Bristol Airport's forecast, isn't it? They haven't forecast it coming back fully this year.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I guess part of the sort of uncertainties which you've been dealing with throughout the day has been what level of rebound, etc., there might be. So my point isn't to sort of argue about one model or another, but that there is actually a further set of factors, which is changing public attitudes and norms, which may well also have an impact on that demand. And it casts a lot of uncertainty on what we might see in future passenger numbers and demand.
And your figure 4, public views on priorities for aviation, reducing aviation, I mean, of course, the airport, Bristol Airport, is one of the absolute leaders, isn't it, of UK airports in seeking to reduce its emissions. I mean, actually, having looked at CAST briefing paper 7, frankly, is doing a whole lot better than most universities. It's investing very large sums of money in producing electric fleets of vehicles and doing other things to reduce its emissions.
Yes, well, as you all know from a recent issue of Private Eye, that has been picked up that that net zero airport doesn't include the flights, does it? So I think... No, but
whilst we Dr. Capstick, with respect, everyone knows that. It didn't need, the investigative brilliance of Private Eye to tell us that. You only have to read our own documents.
Well, I think what we're talking about here is airport expansion from 10 million to 12 million. If we're talking about an increase of 2 million flights, then yes, it would be great if there is an electric fleet on the ground, but the question here is as much about the flights, I think.
Yes, but we know in that context, of course, that CO2 effects from flights will be capped as part of the UK ETS. And I mean, you're an expert in attitude, so I mean, let's not go there. I'll ask other witnesses about that. But there is a legal mechanism for controlling those. Final thing, really, to ask you about, your section 5 is about demand management, and you seem to be a little bit, with respect, sensitive about this on, it's not anti-democratic or anything else, but stopping UK residents from leaving. We live in a very multicultural society, I'm sure you'll agree, Dr. Capstick. You have lots of international students. There are lots of UK nationals who are resident here, lots of people who have relatives in other parts of the world. To constrain capacity in order to stop people flying is in fact profoundly undemocratic. It is profoundly in breach of what most people regard as basic freedoms, isn't it?
Well, it's funny, you use the phrase stopping UK residents from leaving. I'm not aware that, again, COVID notwithstanding, if one has a passport, one can buy a flight. I don't accept the premise of your point, which this is about stopping UK residents from leaving.
Well, your point, your paragraph 5.1, there is nothing inevitable about growth in air passenger demand. Demand arises from a range of factors, including climate change and also available infrastructure. And you also make the point, I think in your paragraph 2, about attitudes and norms are shifting with regard to flying. There is growing public recognition of the need to restrict flying. So let's be absolutely clear then on your position. Is your position that airport capacity should be constrained in order to reduce or restrict, as the title of your section 5 says, restrict or to create demand management?
My position is that creating capacity can lead to creating demand, and that I find it problematic, the idea that's embedded in a lot of the assumptions in Mr. Brass's evidence that growth in demand is some sort of abstract, inevitable thing that will just happen. I think it is much created, deliberately created, as it is a response to what people want. Now, as I mentioned, there are lots of other instances where decisions are taken on infrastructure which, one way or the other, will affect people's choices and so on. So, I mentioned in Wales, not building roads. Now, I don't think that not building roads is undemocratic. It's a decision that's been taken, at least in part because of environmental concerns, and to my mind, not expanding airports, particularly for a country which flies more than any other, is also very firmly in that category.
Yes, 2 or 3 points there. One, why do you think it is that we fly more than many other countries? Think about our land links to the rest of the world. There's only one. We have one land link to the rest of the world, the Channel Tunnel.
Yeah,
and
I think
so
we are. Yeah,
your students who come from Brazil or India or Greece or wherever else in the world have very few opportunities, do they, to come to Cardiff University unless they fly?
Well, we're looking at that. I mean, I can't say what's going to be the outcomes of a lot of discussions at Cardiff, but of course, a lot of studying has switched to virtual.
That's we're not having, Dr. Cassidy, with respect, we're not having a debate. They have very few opportunities to get to the university or to get to the UK unless they fly, do they?
Many of them would not, no.
No, and the same for a lot of UK residents who go on holiday or business trips to other parts of the world, business trips to Japan or North America or whatever. Because we are an island, and quite a small island, flying is one of the few ways in which UK residents can actually get to other parts of the world.
Yeah, I feel like we may be straying from the point a little bit here. So the proof of evidence that I submitted was about social attitudes and a potential impact on flying. I think you're touching on some really rather broader points about what is the purpose of flying and so on. So I don't think it's appropriate to be drawn on those topics.
Okay. Final point, really, I think, induced demand. Of course, that has been a concept relatively well understood for quite a long time now, probably 20 years, in relation to highways, that a lot of highway movements are suppressed because there's not highway capacity, and when a new road is put in, the traffic then, the demand is released. That's very different, isn't it, from airports. People don't go for a holiday in Spain or a business trip in Frankfurt because Bristol Airport has amended Condition 65 in the 2011 planning permission. In other words, releasing a planning condition to allow us to go from 10 million to 12 million doesn't cause people to fly, does it? They fly because they want to go somewhere.
Ultimately, I think there is an argument that it does. I mean, you could, a particular point of the releasing a planning, I forget 65. I don't know the ins and outs, but releasing, allowing the airport to expand leads to more routes, leads to more capacity, and yes, I do think that it works the other way round too.
Okay. Final point then. Of course, it's not government policy, is it, to stop UK residents flying abroad if they want to, or indeed to constrain them from doing so?
Yeah, again, I don't think this is about stopping people doing things, and I don't think the inquiry is about stopping people doing things. I mean, I would say that the Committee on Climate Change, which is the formal advisory body to government, has itself talked about limiting, restricting, I can't remember the exact term, demand. So, this is in mainstream policy advice circles.
But that was rejected by government. Government hasn't imposed that. That's simply, with enormous respect to the CCC, but that was their advice. Government has not accepted that advice, has it?
Sure, but that advice was phrased in the terms I said, not in terms of stopping people from leaving the country.
Okay. Dr. Capsick, thank you very much. Would it be okay if we took briefing paper 8, as we've referred to it quite a lot, and made it a core document in the inquiry? Perhaps Ms. Beth would wish to do that. Would that be okay?
As far as I know, but I don't know the procedures, so I'll defer to Ms. Beth.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Mr. Humphreys. Ms. Beth, have you got any re-examination on matters raised in cross-examination?
Yeah, I do have just a few, and I'm quite happy for that to be a core document. Okay, so just a couple of follow-up, Stuart's. So a survey has been mentioned that was undertaken during COVID times about how a majority of people would have liked to have taken more flights than they have. Now, so firstly, I'd be right to say that they wouldn't have taken any flights on account of restrictions.
Ms. Beth, forgive me, and I've been really, really tolerant in the evidence in chief. When you're dealing with your own witness, you're not allowed to ask leading questions. You're not, okay. And by a leading question, that means a question that suggests the answer to the witness. Now, I've just sort of sat there and bitten my tongue so far, but if you just ask a neutral question, and then Dr. Capsick, he'll understand, he'll be able to answer. Please.
Right, okay. I've also been given advice that I have to do yes-no questions, which is why some of my questions did tend to be leading, so I'm getting a little confused at this point.
Well, the advice about yes-no questions came from us, and we stand by it because it's much easier to understand if the witness says yes and qualifies, or no then qualifies. However, in re-examination, Mr. Humphreys got there a fraction of a second before me. Leading questions are really difficult to avoid. I do appreciate that, but it needs to be very, very neutral.
Okay. Okay. Right. So what date was that survey you were referred to?
October 2020.
Sorry, Dr. Capstick, could you move the mic back up again?
Oh, sorry. It's usually okay. I don't know why it's not working.
Don't worry.
2020, and that would be in COVID times, yeah?
Yes.
So possibly a little questionable. Sorry,
I
it's
think.
leading.
Okay. May I try and answer what I think is going on here? And that is that if you ask people in the middle of a lockdown who can barely even leave their houses, never mind fly abroad, might you have flown more? Then yes, they may well have flown, given what we all know happened last year and this year.
Okay. Now, you quote somebody saying that return to COVID levels may not be for some years. Now, your evidence is about social attitudes, not about forecasting figures. But if I told you that the core case figure is 8.8 million passengers per annum next year, which is just about where the airport was in 2019, would you consider that consistent with not returning for several years?
No, I'm actually quite surprised to hear you say that. And I don't, I shouldn't get drawn into the models and the parameters, but that, to my mind, that seems pretty implausible.
But you would accept that you're not a forecasting expert?
I would accept that, yes.
Yeah, okay. Now, we talked a bit at the end about government policy to constrain travel. I mean, you have made it clear that you've said that you are not constraining capacity, you're looking to not expand it.
Yes, correct. And I do think there is a difference. So Mr. Humphreys refers to stopping UK residents from leaving the country, and I think that's a mischaracterisation, I'm afraid, of not expanding.
And in terms of this not being government policy, well, actually, this is outside your area of expertise, but have you got any recent information on government
Well, if it's outside his area of expertise,
Expertise
you
should
shouldn't
leave it
ask the
alone,
question.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. The only other thing I was going to go back to was your survey, figure 2 in your proof, which asks these people these 8 different personal actions they can take. So are any of these really specific about exactly what the action would entail and what the consequences would be?
No, and I think that's, that's why we need to think about surveys from the point of view of the people filling them in. If we were to say, would you like to see a 38.2% reduction in aviation over the next 5.5 years? It doesn't make sense. So we have to ask people questions in terms that they can understand. What questions like this tell us is where people think the biggest impact can be made. And as we can see, they view that as being about, transport and home energy use primarily.
Okay, thank you. That's the end of my questions. You'd be glad to know.
Thank you very much, Ms. Beth. Re-examination is always a sensitive and difficult one. Advocates get very excited about it, so do inspectors, so don't worry. Okay, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Capstick. I don't think we've got anything for you, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
What do you think? Pull up stumps now? Finish now? Finish now rather than try and get over. It's another example. Ms. Beth, on the programme, I mean, that's concluded the evidence that we had on the programme for today. I noticed that your next witness, you've got an hour evidence in chief. Well, firstly, is it likely to be an hour or is it likely to be less? And secondly, indeed, is your second witness available?
So my second witness is also virtual, Sally Lawson, and I can see that she is here. She's available. I think it will be about an hour.
Okay, and I'm conscious that you weren't expecting to move on, so I think on that basis we'll conclude today and start off again tomorrow morning. Don't think there's anything outstanding by way of housekeeping from me, so on that basis, thank you all very much. We'll resume 9:30 tomorrow.